Potawatomi,
arts,
culture,
and entertainment.
This is a Pace production.
Warm welcome to Dr. Richard Warner.
Well, thank you very much. So, what is historic about Council Bluffs anyway? Every town has its past, but I really think Council Bluffs has touched more history of regional and even national importance than most cities its size, and even more than many cities much larger. So tonight, let's go through that. Now, 170 years of history in about 35 minutes, give or take, is kind of a tall order, but I'm up for it. I think we can do it. Now, keep in mind, these topics we're going to touch on, any one of them could easily be a whole program in and of itself. So we're just going to hit the highlights. If you hear something that you think would make a really good program, well, talk to the director of programming, and that's Adam, and maybe he can arrange something. Now, a sobering thought before we get too carried into this. After listening to, or should I say enduring, many of my Council Bluffs history tales at family gatherings, one of my daughter-in-laws, Tara, came to an observation. She said, after listening to your stories, I don't think that many people ever wanted to come to Council Bluffs. What happened is Council Bluffs is right on the way of where people did want to go. Most of the people were just passing through. And I got thinking, she might have a point there. I mean, Lewis and Clark, 1804, passed through. The Mormons came in 1846. They stayed for a little while, but then the Saints moved on west. The wagon trains, the California gold rushers, they passed through. First cross-country automobile trip, passed through. The first woman to drive coast to coast in an automobile passed through. The first transcontinental highway passed through. I mean, even today, we are the crossroads of two major interstate highways. So we've got tens of thousands of people, or hundreds of thousands probably, passing through. But so what? I don't think that matters. I would say our position on the way west has given us a tremendous amount of history. So, would you say we are gateway to the west? I don't know. It's a pretty crowded field. I personally don't think I really want to get involved in that. I'll be perfectly honest with you, I have no idea where the west began. But I do know where the east ended, and that's right here in Council Bluffs. And that map shows it all. What happened was, well, it all started out, it'll be 101 years ago next month. What happened here in Council Bluffs in August 1859 markedly changed, more than anything, the history of Omaha and Council Bluffs, of Iowa and Nebraska, and I'm going to say made an impact on the United States and even the world. Well, what happened was, growing up in Council Bluffs, I was vaguely familiar with this story of Abraham Lincoln and General Dodge meeting, okay? But I had it all wrong. In my mind, these two great railroad builders, here you had President Abraham Lincoln and General Grenville Dodge, and they came to Council Bluffs, and they had this big important meeting as to where to put the Transcontinental Railroad. Of course, that's not at all what happened. I mean, Dodge not only wasn't a general, he wasn't even a great railroad builder. He was basically just a kid in his 20s, a young man that was a surveyor for the M&M Railroad. And of course, Lincoln wasn't president. In fact, he hadn't even intended to come to Council Bluffs. Well, what happened was he was doing some politicking. Did a little political tour down in Kansas. And on the way back, he had to take a steamboat to get to St. Joe. And from there, he was going to catch a train and go back east. And the steamboat captain said, well, I'm going up to Council Bluffs. You want to come along? I'm just going to drop off my stuff and come back. Your train doesn't leave till tomorrow. You got plenty of time to catch it. And Lincoln said, well, okay. He had a couple of friends in Council Bluffs, H.M. Pusey and Thomas Officer from back in his Illinois days. Also, it'd be a good chance to check out a little bit of land. A friend of his, Norman Judd, was into speculating on railroads, but he was a little short of cash. So he hit Abe Lincoln up for a loan. And in collateral for this loan, he offered this piece of land that he owned in Council Bluffs. He said, okay, I'll go up, I'll take a look at the land, say hi to my friends, and have plenty of time to get back to catch the train. Well, as it turned out, the steamboat got stuck on a sandbar, and he ended up spending 3 days here. And somewhere around day 2 or day 3, General Dodge, or Grenville Dodge, sorry, it wasn't General, came into town from one of his surveying trips, wandered over to the Pacific House Hotel to see what was going on, and he met Lincoln. Talk about accidentally historic. Now, the place where this happened, like I said, I think it changed the course of the whole, certainly Iowa, Nebraska, and impacted on the United States. This has to be the most historic site in all of Omaha Council Bluffs. In fact, sometimes I get goosebumps when I drive past this site. You know the site I'm talking about, right? It's this place right here. Okay, so it doesn't look like that much right now. You know, maybe we need, Adam, you're really handy with tools, and you got all these artisans around. You think maybe you could get us like a historical marker or something there? The most historic site in all of Omaha Council Bluffs, and it looks like that. Now, actually, our historical society isn't that bad. We did have a marker there, but it was on a building, and the building was torn down. We still got the marker. It's in the closet at one of the museums. If anybody ever builds a building, I guess we can put it back. But it didn't look like that in 1859. It looked like that. It was the Pacific House Hotel. So let's put this in a time frame. This was, Lincoln was not officially a presidential candidate at this time. He had just lost the race for Senate in Illinois. This was right after the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. And just not to, so there's no confusion, that's not really Lincoln and Douglas over there. That's actually my niece Rosalie and I. So Lincoln was not officially a presidential candidate, but I really think he was probably doing some politicking, and I think maybe that was one of the reasons to come to Council Bluffs. He was kind of testing the waters. Oh, the guy in the stovepipe hat, that's not really Abe Lincoln, that's my brother. You know, we are such suckers when we travel for these museum gimmicks where you get to dress up. We just can't get enough of those things. Then, so Lincoln becomes president. 1862 issues this vague proclamation designating Council Bluffs as the eastern terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, all of a sudden, Council Bluffs is important. It dawned on the railroads out east that, if we could connect to this line going west, we're going to profit handsomely. So all of a sudden, after 1862, the race was on, and the tracks were running across Iowa, all headed to the same place, and that place they were headed was Council Bluffs. So how did this affect us? Our growth positively exploded. Our population doubled in just a few years. In 1888 alone, we put up 1,200 new buildings. You got to keep in mind, at this time, everything revolved around the railroads. And you want railroads? We got it. We got more railroads than anybody west of the Mississippi. So if you want to be in the hot spot of the nation, you better have a presence in Council Bluffs. And come they did. A huge manufacturing district developed right in this area we are right now. And we were making everything from carriages to cigars to confectionery because the railroads made it easy to get supplies in and get the finished products back out again. Now, all of this could give a town a swelled head. And I think we did. I think there was this prevailing attitude, this positive attitude. And I've got nothing against a positive attitude, but late 19th century, early 20th century, I really think that the business leaders and the civic leaders of Council Bluffs thought we could do no wrong. I really think they believed in a few years we would become, to our section of the Midwest, what Chicago had become to the Great Lakes region 25 years earlier. We were positively unstoppable. And again, I got nothing against a little civic pride and a positive attitude, but it was almost like it was a giddy euphoria. To go back and look at some of that promotional literature coming out of Council Bluffs at that time, I mean, perfect climate, physical beauty. I guess that's a judgmental thing. Who needs seashores and mountains when you got the Missouri River and Great Plains, right? My favorite is low mortality. They claimed, and there's a great quote, and I don't have it right in front of me, but only 217 burial permits were issued last year, proving that Council Bluffs has a lower mortality than anywhere in the world. No, that's true. They actually wrote that. My dad lived to be 99 years old, and he was very healthy right up to the end. I always figured it was because he had a healthy lifestyle and enjoyed some good genetics. But if you buy into this, it's all because the ancestors pushed on to Council Bluffs. I mean, God forbid they'd have stopped in Kankakee. Dad would have probably been a goner in his 60s. So he just got a little carried away. But it was good for us. A big stockyards developed. The ice stocks were built to put ice in all those railroad cars so the perishables could make that cross-country trip. Very labor-intensive, but it was good for us because it created a lot of jobs. We were making train wheels, tens of thousands of train wheels down on 9th Avenue. So, Council Bluffs has got to be a place the civic leaders are proud of, right? I mean, this has got to be one really classy place. So, how do you explain a quote like this from a modern-day historian? The wily skills shown on the muddy streets of Council Bluffs during the late 19th century would be the envy of any author of a Nigerian email scam circulating the internet today. So what's that all about? Comparing Council Bluffs to a Nigerian email scam? I mean, what's with that anyway? Now, Growing up in Council Bluffs, I'd heard the tales of the notorious Ocean Wave Saloon and this wild side, but I just figured it was just talk. Every western town, frontier town, has its wild side, right? But it wasn't until I started studying Council Bluffs history that I realized we really were worse than anybody else. It's unbelievable what went on here. But this is no random act, ladies and gentlemen. There is a very, very good reason that Council Bluffs developed this way. Did you know 100 years ago, we built a statue in the likeness of the first woman to ever appear completely naked in an American film? I don't make this stuff up. You better be here in a couple of weeks. Okay, so what happened? By the time I came along in the 1970s, why are you looking at me like that? Okay, by the time I came along in the 1960s, by the time I came along in the 1950s, Adam, this is one tough crowd. Don't try and pull anything over on them. Okay, by the time I came along in the 1950s, Council Bluffs looked like it was a relic from the past. It looked like nothing had changed in years. We were describing ourselves as the sleeping giant, which is kind of a euphemism for not much going on. What happened? Well, basically, it was because we were a railroad town, and solely a railroad town. 25% of our people worked directly for the railroads, and think of how many more worked for industries that were supported by the railroads. Now, the railroads remain strong. The railroads are very, very strong today. But what happened was technology. It didn't take as many people to keep those trains rolling. The diesel engines didn't require firemen. The diesels didn't require nearly as much maintenance in the roundhouses. The ice docks, those guys were put out of a job by refrigerator cars. Our massive mail terminal, the zip code, made it obsolete due to automation. So what happened was in the 1950s, railroad employment dropped by 23%. 23%, that is absolutely huge in a town supported by the railroads. So the bottom line is the loss of these high-paying jobs meant people had less money to spend in stores. Our stores had less money to upgrade, making them look like they weren't up with the times, leading more and more business to grow across the river to those brand new stores in Omaha. A whopping 77% of Southwest Iowa retail business was going to Omaha. So something drastic had to be done. And that was the Downtown Urban Renewal Project. It was a gamble. Really no town in America had done anything quite like that. We took 40 square blocks and mowed down all 109 buildings in it. Now, it didn't really bring us out of the economic doldrums. It might have helped a little bit, but that's a whole subject in and of itself. Then in the 1980s, Bluffs Run came along, and that kind of ushered in, and with Iowa West, ushered in a whole new era. And again, that's a whole program in and of itself. But certainly anybody who's been around for a while knows the last 30 years in Council Bluffs, things have really changed for the better. It looks like a whole different place. And of course, the best manifestation of that is this absolutely beautiful facility that we're in right here tonight. Now, I'll show you how pounded down we were growing up in the 1950s as I was. When Adam took me on a tour of this beautiful place a few weeks ago, I could hardly wait to get home. I got down to my email and emailed all my friends and said, guys, you won't believe this place. It doesn't look like it belongs in Council Bluffs. I mean, we got so jaded. It's like, whoa, this looks like it belongs in some big city or at least Omaha or something. And it's ours, so it's really cool. So that's how basically we got from point A to point B. Now, I said that we had some very historic things that happened, so let's take a few minutes and talk about some of those. Now, we already talked about being milepost of the Transcontinental Railroad and the birthplace of the Union Pacific Railroad. We were where Brigham Young became the second president of the Mormon Church at the Tabernacle here. I don't know that's anything to brag about. There have been copycat robberies since, but we were the first big-time mail robbery right here. The largest robbery in the history of the world. By the way, those local yahoos were rounded up within 48 hours, but this will be 100 years in November, and the money has never been found. Now, they claim they panicked and threw it in the Missouri River. So if you're out there boating, and you see some greenbacks pop up, you'll know where it's come from. The first nursing school west of the Mississippi was in Council Bluffs. Only young ladies of high moral character that could read or write were admitted, of course. Council Bluffs, the first city to dedicate the Lincoln Highway. Of course, we had to do this on the day it was supposed to open. We had the celebration at 12:01 just so we could claim that title. And of course, they would definitely have the leg up over the people in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. But hey, a win is a win, okay? We got to prove Wikipedia wrong. Look at that. MASH units, the first ones were established 1945 and deployed during the Korean War. Well, there's one problem with that statement. It's wrong, wrong, wrong. Thanks to Dr. McCrae, former Council Bluffs mayor and surgeon, and Council Bluffs, thousands of lives of World War I soldiers were saved. Well, Dr. McCrae was in the Spanish-American War, and he realized that, there's a lot of trauma to move an injured soldier to the hospital. Why don't we move the hospital to the injured soldier? He pitched the idea to the Army and they said, go for it. One problem, we don't have any money. So McCrae was a stubborn old cuss apparently. He said, well, I don't care. Not only are we going to staff it, we are going to fund it. So he started a fund drive. He solicited donations of supplies, of money, of equipment. Mrs. McCrae, in the middle there, she discharged her servants, sold her automobile, and organized a ladies' club to roll bandages. Even put up a platform on her lawn and had local bands come and then passed the hat. And so Council Bluffs really is responsible for, it was almost all the doctors were from Council Bluffs. 16 of the 21 nurses were from Council Bluffs, which, by the way, is another first for us. Council Bluffs women were the first to be on a battlefield in an American war in modern times. The Army did not allow women at the front lines. McCrae, again, being the stubborn old guy that he was, said, no, you want my Mobile One, we move as a unit. And they all moved together. Now, if you're excited about this and want to research more about it, and you start poking around the internet, eventually you will stumble across a YouTube video that comes out and says that those Ivy League weasels at Yale claim to have the first mobile unit. Now, it is true that one of their docs was in the Spanish-American War, and it came up with the idea about the time of Dr. McCrae. I will admit that. However, I checked it out carefully. Our Mobile One was mustered first. However, they did get to France first. But that is all trivial, ladies and gentlemen, because the big, the big item here is they're a fake. They are a fraud. They got to France and attached to a base hospital. A mobile hospital that isn't mobile, that doesn't really count, does it? So they never moved. They never even saw the front lines, and our Mobile One moved 14 times, all within a few miles of the front line. So this is definitely something to be proud of. So why do they have this fancy video and we don't? I'm guessing it's because they have a bigger budget. Adam, another project for us there, We'll teach those Ivy Leaguers where the first mobile hospital was. Okay, Council Bluffs was also the first capital of Nebraska. Even got a picture of the legislative chambers right here. I don't make this stuff up, ladies and gentlemen. The first governor of the state of Nebraska was Francis Burt. Well, he was appointed by President Pierce. He'd actually never set foot in Nebraska, but he dutifully headed west. Somewhere around St. Louis, he got sick. And he got sicker and sicker the closer he got to Nebraska. And he finally made Nebraska, tumbled into his bed, never got out of bed, and died 2 days later. So he wanted the capital to be Bellevue, but he didn't live long enough to make that happen. So instead, the honor went to Thomas Cumming. And Thomas Cumming, he was a crafty one. He was very much in league with Council Bluffs businessmen. And so he made very sure that anything that transpired in Omaha City was in favor of Council Bluffs. And so he set up shop at the Pacific House Hotel, which is where he stayed. And in fact, most of the votes, most of the action in those early days took place right there. The first mail terminal in the United States was formed in Council Bluffs. Now, you know how the mail was transferred in those days, or sorted in those days. It was on the railway post office cars. We got one at Rails West. You can go up there and get on it if you'd like. I mean, how clever. Sort the mail and move it at the same time. It was wonderful. It worked very well, very efficient. But you saw that map at the beginning of the program. All of those rail lines come together in Council Bluffs. Well, what happened is mail would come off one train, it'd have to go to another one, and in reality, it ended up sitting a lot of time, spent a lot of time just sitting around at the transfer yard. So one of our guys, Harold B. Stowe, suggested, why don't we just sort some of it while it's sitting here? And so the Postal Department went for that idea. By 1913, it caught on, and there were mail terminals across the country. Not only did It speed the mail. It also opened the way for parcel post. As efficient as those RPO cars were, they couldn't carry packages. You couldn't mail a package by the U.S. mail prior to 1913. So parcel post was all responsible because of a Council Bluffs guy. The longest military march in history left from Council Bluffs. Now, while the U.S. Army has had, as recently as World War II, units that were composed of a certain race, this is the only unit that was ever composed of people just based on a certain religion. They marched, 500 men marched almost 2,000 miles from Council Bluffs to San Diego in the Mexican War. The first building ever built to house a radio station was in Council Bluffs. Now that may seem like I'm grasping at straws here, but think about it. In 1925, all programming was live. And so acoustics and soundproofing and studio layout, those were all very important things. And the first building to do that was right here in Council Bluffs. It still stands. It's on Huntington Avenue. It's an apartment now. Not sure this is anything to brag about, but the first moving train ever to be robbed left from Council Bluffs.
The robbers were on the south side of the track and pulled the north rail.
The remainder of the gang kept the passengers terrorized with pistols.
Two of the gang are the James Boys of Clay County, Missouri.
That was the first of the 6 train robberies credited to the James gang.
The largest Rotary cell jail, the only Rotary cell jail that had a 3-story rotating cage, was built in Council Bluffs.
It was made for ease of use of the jailer. So an unarmed jailer can manage all the inmates housed within just basically by turning a hand crank.
The first high school ROTC program was in Council Bluffs.
If war broke out, the cadets would immediately become part of the state militia. 16-year-olds would get their rifles at Council Bluffs High School that they'd been practicing with, and they would take over.
The first FM radio station in the state of Iowa was in Council Bluffs. William Ware, the manager of that FM radio station, insisted that FM and its better sound quality will take over. And he was right. His station became #1. He was a bit optimistic, though. It took 42 years before that prediction came true.
98 is KQKQ-FM, Council Bluffs, with more music and better variety.
Now, in case these plugs were a little too subtle, I'll point out that what I'm pointing out, or what I've made reference to, is our Accidentally Historic podcast. It's, if you are listening to podcasts, whatever podcast app you use, you should be, I use iTunes, just put in Accidentally Historic, and we've only been doing it a few months, so only a handful of pods have been cast, so to speak, as of this point. But we got some interesting things on there. If you are not into podcasts, as long as you have something that gets on the internet, a smartphone, a tablet like an iPad or something, or a desktop computer with a loudspeaker, just go to accidentallyhistoric.com, push the little button, and you'll be up and running. Oh, Council Bluffs was the first place John J. Audubon ever saw a yellow-headed trubial. I've never heard of it, but he was tremendously impressed. It was a big deal to him. He wrote on and on about how great Council Bluffs was because of that. Okay, we could go on and on, but I promised Adam I wasn't going to run over here. So, all right, let's look at some of George Simon's sketches. And we're very lucky because in these pre-photography days, we had this guy who did these really accurate drawings, and he was very prolific about it. So, you know, it looks like my pointer does not work on the screen here, so I'll just, if you don't mind, just point out a couple of things. That teeny little building up there, that was the powder house. That's where gunpowder was kept. That would be the first brick building in Potawatomi County. And we didn't have a brickyard at that time. The bricks had to come up all the way from St. Louis. Let's zoom in a little bit lower. And this area right in here, now this would be the area around Pierce Street, Union Street, and Grace Street today, and that's normally just referred to as the blockhouse. And that was built by U.S. military dragoons to protect the Indians. It was built in 1837. And our Potawatomi Indians had some really bad enemies in the Dakota Sioux. And so they built this to protect them. It turned out it never did see any military action, so Father DeSmit was able to use it as a mission and as a school. And the Mormons actually used it. They bought it and used it as their first church before they had their tabernacle built. And then that became the site of Pierce Street School, built in 1884. It was torn down in 1950. Now, if you're as old as I am, you'll remember that for 2 decades, that just sat there. There was nothing there at all. Of course, in more recent times, we got that apartment building. And yeah, that wall looks about the same, doesn't it? Now, one of the first things that jumped out at me, the first time I ever saw Simon's sketches, was the main drag through town. It's straight as an arrow. And if you kept on going, it would eventually run into the river and the ferry. But in my time, and in fact for the past 150 years, we've got this screwball kink on our main drag at 4th Street. What is with that? Well, you know, that old saying, that rule of real estate, location, 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 right? Well, if you can't afford to put your property or to build your building in an expensive property, why don't you bring the expensive property to you? And that's what Sam Bayless did. Bayless created his Pacific House Hotel over here on this less expensive side street, and then opened a new ferry up here further upstream. In the process, shifting the traffic pattern further up. And that's a pattern that we still are saddled with even today. He also dabbled in the creation of Omaha City. Plenty of skullduggery in that little story. Now, one interesting thing to note while we're looking at this picture, when I was a kid, if somebody would have said, where is downtown Council Bluffs? I'd have said, oh, probably around Main and Pearl Street and Broadway. And that would be this area that Sam Bayless pretty well made a main thoroughfare right there. But if you notice back in the early times when Simons first got here, Canesville, early days of Council Bluffs, it was all over here, more up towards 1st Street, Benton Avenue, and where the Tabernacle is today. So now that we have this also-ran property a little further south, it's no longer prime real estate. What ended up going in there? Well, Bayless bought that for $250 and donated it for a courthouse. Except the courthouse ended up getting built two blocks further south in 1866. Little politics involved. Bayless had kind of fallen out of favor by that time. This sat as kind of a weed-infested patch for a long time. Then the city finally developed it as a park. 1887, the fountain was acquired, and looking through the trees, you can see the beautiful Grand Hotel over there. And the Grand Hotel was indeed just that. It was grand. It was a beauty. Very, very elegant. Now, you know, I don't want to be picky and second-guess them, but if I had to make one criticism, I would take issue with their advertising campaign. Honestly, ladies and gentlemen, isn't it thumbing your nose at fate to advertise that you're completely fireproof? I don't need to push the button, do I? You know what's going to happen next. Indeed, there was so little left after the fire, so little left of the Grand Hotel, that it was demolished and a new hotel built, that being the Chieftain by Eugene Epley. And of course, we'll be talking more about Grant Wood's paintings when we get upstairs. Epley commissioned this relatively unknown Iowa artist, Grant Wood, to do these paintings for not only this hotel, but also his properties in Cedar Rapids and in Sioux City. Well, Council Bluffs continues to grow. Let's zoom in. Looks like we got a little industrial tract going here. Zoom in on the smokestack and take a look at the city roller mills. That was started by John Baldwin and Grenville Dodge. 1907, it was replaced by the City Auditorium, built in just 30 days for the horticultural exhibition, and it was a casualty of that aggressive urban renewal that we talked about earlier. It was torn down in 1973 to become the Midland Small Parking Garage. Now look at all of the brick that we've gotten here and how many buildings we've gotten, and this shouldn't be any surprise. Remember, we said once in 1862, once this was designated as, you know, where the east ended, if you will, of the way west, Council Bluffs just continued to grow, and all of those railroads contributed to that rapid growth. Let's see a steeple there. Let's zoom in and check that out. That, of course, would be the Broadway Methodist Church, but not the one we know. It's the one on the left. It didn't even last 30 years. It developed a crack in the side, and it was too small. And so in 1891, the new Broadway Methodist Church was built. And that, of course, still stands today. And if you grew up in Council Bluffs, you know the story that the Broadway Methodist Church was built on the site of the notorious Ocean Wave Saloon. Something we're going to be talking about 2 weeks from tonight. Now, suffice it to say, lightning had to strike twice to transform the corner of 1st and Broadway from a sinkhole of sin into a sanctuary of salvation. So a fun question is, are there any buildings here today that were here in Grant Wood's time? I'm going to say no from those earlier sketches, but on this painting, I'm going to say yeah. I think that one with the arrow right there. So when would this be? Well, we just looked. We noticed there's no steeple, and we just said the Methodist Church was 1868, so we know it's prior to that. We can see the Ocean Wave Saloon right there. We know that was taken out by lightning in 1861, so we know this must be prior to that. We also said the first brickyard came in 1853, and we noticed some brick buildings. So I think we can pretty well identify this as being somewhere between 1853 and 1861. I did find these drawings, that would be those buildings that the arrow points to, and this was labeled 1861. And if we look at it today, that would be the corner of 1st and Broadway. Those are presumably the oldest buildings still standing in Council Bluffs, right there. Now, I mentioned earlier, a little teaser, that what happened 101 years ago on the veranda of the Pacific House Hotel, August 1859, not only impacted Council Bluffs, Omaha, Iowa, and Nebraska, but the United States and the world. So let me just take a moment to talk about that. And this isn't my idea. We had a college professor come and talk to us a few years ago. He had a really interesting point. He said railroads normally were built from a population center to the nearest waterway. He said nowhere in the world had anybody built a railroad that would cross a continent until here. And our railroad went right through the middle of everything. We went through the Great Plains. It went through the mountains. It went through the forests. Look at all those natural resources it opened up. And so this professor's point was, now we had a way to get to these resources. We had a way to get people to get out there, settle that land, farm that land, do the mining, do the forestry, and a way to get those products back to markets. This gave us a huge economic boost in the arm and gave us the leg up to become the world power that we remain today. I thought it was an interesting point. So, in summary, we basically owe our history to our location. We're on the way of where people are going, and particularly we're on the way of where the railroad was going. And so I thought, to wrap up this phase of it, why don't we pay tribute to the railroad that was born here? I mean, the Union Pacific gave us prominence. It gave us General Dodge. It gave us the Union Pacific Museum. And it gave us the most truly awe-inspiring advertising jingle ever created. And best yet, it's a hometown thing. This jingle was written by a Southwest Iowa guy, Bill Fries, for a business that was envisioned in Council Bluffs. Music written by a couple of Omahans who went on to, Chip Davis and Jackson Berkey, went on to be Mannheim Steamroller, and recorded in Omaha. And the most important thing is, it's the coolest jingle ever created. Now, I know it's hard not to sing along, so you know the song, go right ahead, have some fun with it. Great big rolling railroad. I don't hear you. Now, the only problem is, anytime I hear that jingle, it's stuck in my mind for weeks at a time. So you can thank me for that. But it's the coolest jingle and written by a Southwest Iowan. Okay, now I think we're going to take a 15-minute break. We're going to meet upstairs, and we're just going to talk a little bit about some things, but mostly that'll be a good time we can answer some questions. Oh, by the way, that's not really Grant Wood's painting. Okay?